All right, we are back looking at Picasso's Young Ladies of Avignon. These are not just any general young ladies, but Avignon gives us a clue as to what we're looking at. Avignon is the name of the red light district in Barcelona, where Picasso grew up, and so we are looking at a group of prostitutes, and we see an earlier sketch here of this monumental painting that Picasso did. And what we notice in this sketch is that in the original concept, Picasso included these two clothed male figures. This one wearing a kind of judge's robe, this one wearing a suit. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, how does that change the final product, to take those two men out? And I think what it does is that it gives us, we have, as the viewer, a different interaction now with these figures. We're no longer looking as an outsider into a closed scene, but instead we're drawn in to a kind of interaction with these women. And look at how these women are depicted. They are a little bit, frightening. They look out at us with these kind of bold, blank stares. And Picasso has broken down, he has fractured the shapes of the figures here so that we are left with figures where it's hard to tell kind of where does the body stop and start? Where does the scenery take place? That difference between positive and negative space has become very unclear, which is a little bit unsettling. Picasso's also doing something else, and we see that here in the faces of these two figures on the far right of the composition in particular. He is inspired from masks from Africa that he is seeing in new ethnographic museums that are in Paris at the time. And this use of source material that is non-European, that is exotic and a little bit mysterious, it brings this element of the fear and fascination of the other. And by other, I mean capital O other, as non-European figures here. These women are both sexually available and a little bit terrifying at the same time. And this makes sense. You know, in 1907, this is the peak of European imperialism and colonialism throughout the world. And artists are interested in these new artworks that are flooding into European museums from around the world, but yet they also are viewing them from that kind of European superiority attitude, that this is so-called primitive work that is lesser than, that is more exotic and more frightening, more intimidating. Picasso continues with this fracturing of figures, this abstract approach in his work. And this movement is called Cubism, because look at this portrait here. It looks like the figure has been broken down into all of these tiny little cubes. And in fact, it's even hard to see now, a few years down the road from Young Women of Avignon. It's hard to even see the person here in this abstract matrix on the canvas. The sitter is Kahnweiler, who was an art dealer who concentrated on contemporary works. He was a major conduit to the art world for modern abstract artworks, artists like Picasso. And in this painting, we see the major characteristics of Cubism. We see one figure who has been broken up into all of these different planes and surfaces that don't really seem to fit together into one cohesive shape. We also see multiple viewpoints within the figure. So for example, we have different angles shown of the nose, different angles of the head. We also have different light sources too. There's light coming from here, from down below, from off to the left. There's a kind of multiplicity that denies us one single narrative or interpretation in this piece. It's as if the painting constitutes its own reality. And in fact, Picasso said, "We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie that makes us realize the truth." Art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. I think this is exactly what is going on in the portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, because for Picasso and other abstract painters, this kind of representation, they believe, is closer to capturing complex reality than the kind of hyper-realism and hyper-naturalism we've seen in other works. Some of you might know the work of the modern Mexican artist Frida Kahlo. Some of you might have seen Salma Hayek's biopic on Kahlo. And if you're looking for something to watch right now, I highly recommend this movie. Frida Kahlo depicts a lot of self-portraits, and we see in her painting here, we see a kind of double self-portrait that she calls Two Fridas. What we have is two likenesses of Kahlo. One on the left side, wearing a more kind of Victorian, European style dress, with the heart exposed and the artery that we can trace here that is connected to the Frida on the right-hand side, who is wearing a more typical Mexican indigenous dress. And she holds in her hand, this is hard to see, but it's a little tiny locket. And that locket shows us a portrait of Diego Rivera, who is Frida's on-again, off-again partner. In 1939, they had just gotten divorced. And so we see this little portrait of Rivera here. Frida herself kind of felt like she was often in two different worlds. Her father was a European, a Hungarian Jew. Her mother was Mexican and traced her ancestry to different indigenous cultures in Mexico and to Spanish colonists as well. And so often we see that Frida kind of feels like she's in a few different worlds. And often her work is described as surreal. We have this kind of dreamlike landscape. We have these weird, irrational elements like the hearts here, the doubling of the figure, that often make us think about surrealism. And in fact, her work was often appropriated by the modern surrealist artists who were interested in the irrational. They were interested in dreams and the kind of weird imagery that we all have in our dreams. But Kahlo said of her own work, "I don't paint dreams. I paint my own reality." And I think the artist's own analysis of her work is really important in understanding the kind of irrational imagery that we see in a portrait like Two Fridas. All right, we're going to move to work from post-World War II, post-1945. And what we see in this group of work is we see a kind of expansion of the art world, not just paintings, not just sculptures on pedestals, but including works like this piece from Yoko Ono. Yes, the Yoko Ono, who was married to Beatles musician John Lennon. And this is a performance piece. I highly encourage you to use the list of video links that I give you for Unit 5 and watch a video of this performance, because it is a live, kind of almost theatrical performance that she performed in New York City in 1965 called Cut Piece. And you don't need to watch the whole thing, but I encourage you to just kind of watch some clips here or there between kind of through the video itself. And I will be right back with a third video to finish up this unit.